Hi, everybody. Sorry.
Welcome to today's event. We will now begin.
Hi there. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased you could join us here today. My name's Julie Margetta Morgan. I'm the president of the Century Foundation. And for those of you who may be new to our work, the Century Foundation is an independent think tank committed to transformative and progressive policy solutions that give families a better life. And the Century Foundation has really deep roots in education policy. We've spent decades researching how to strengthen our public schools and ensure that every child, no matter their background or zip code, has access to a high quality education. And for me personally, I've been working on education policy issues for most of my career. I served as Senator Warren's education counsel very early in my career, and I fought alongside AFT and others for more federal investment in education. And then most recently, I got to see the very real and quite impossible trade-offs that school districts across the country are required to make when I was serving as a school board member in my own town. Public education is something that we've always had to fight for, but today it's facing a deliberate and coordinated strategy that's aimed at dismantling the education system as we know it. And this strategy isn't only about our schools, it's about power. It's about who gets to shape the next generation's understanding of democracy, of our history, of justice, and of their own agency to change that system. And in times like these, we need strong leaders who have a clarity of purpose and who can communicate clearly what's at stake and what we can do to change it. And that's why I'm so thrilled to be here today with Randy Weingarten, who is the president of the American Federation of Teachers and who is definitely one of those leaders. Randy has written a book, Why Teachers Fear, Why, sorry, Why Fascists Fear Teachers, that is incredibly important as an account of what's happening in public education and also why it's happening. And we have two other leaders here with us today, Marcia Howard, who is the president of the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers and is on the front lines of some of the Trump administration's attacks. And Mike Pierce, the executive director of Protect Borrowers, who's been a really critical partner to me and to AFT as well in combating the Trump administration's efforts to use financial precarity and indebtedness to support their authoritarian agenda. So I'm really delighted to have all of these people here today. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping notes. For accessibility purposes, we have live CART and ASL interpretation. Please note that this event is being recorded and live streamed. And if you'd like to submit a question for our panelists, please do so using the comment feature. So with that, I'm actually going to start us with a few questions just for Randy on her book, and then we'll welcome our other guests into the conversation. So I just want to thank you, Randy, so much for being here with us. And I'll start us off with a pretty easy question. You wrote this book during a time where, not only were teachers and public schools under attack, but many other parts of our economy and our democracy were fraying. And even before Donald Trump came in, you were leading AFT through pretty unprecedented times with a worldwide pandemic. So, what inspired you to write a book amidst all of this, and what do you hope that book will do?
First off, Julie, thank you. And thank you for your leadership. I feel like we've known each other for a lifetime in so many of your different positions, and you do all of them extraordinarily well.
Thank you.
You and I have been through a bunch of these different fights. Sorry, I am in a hotel room in Newark because I'm on my way from Washington, D.C., where I was this morning, to Kane University this evening. And I wanted to make sure that I was in a place that you could hear me. And because I would, and so
You
excuse
look you
the,
look great.
good. Thank you. Sorry. I was trying to figure out a place to sit where you didn't have to see the bed. But in some ways, this is also what we learned in COVID, that we could actually communicate with each other in lots of different places, in lots of different ways, in a virtual way. And those were, and that actually were in some ways the benefits of what has happened with social media and the internet and the different kinds of ways of communication. But then there are lots and lots and lots and lots of detriments about it. And that gets me into why I wrote this book. Then in every I'm a social studies teacher. I'm a lawyer. When I was growing up, I read every single book I could possibly get my hands on about the Holocaust. I come from a family of where we've had Holocaust survivors in our family. My sister's husband, parents were Holocaust survivors. My best friend's parents were Holocaust survivors. So growing up, I heard a lot about, what happened during World War II and why never again would mean never again. And I spent a lot of time thinking about comparative governments. And in some ways, that was what, debate, social studies, democracy, that was, what I academically gravitated to. How do you make things better? How do you have a better life? What do people who don't want to work on a better life do to divide people? And what was clear to me starting about 10 years ago, but because I was the president of the teachers union in New York City with Giuliani and Bloomberg, and it was not sweetness and light, but it was a different kind of fight. It was not a fight, as you just said, it was not an existential battle over weather. It was, how do you do education? Do you do different? It was not existential about weather. And now we have an existential battle about whether public education, and that battle has its roots, yes, in what was happening in our country before Brown versus Board of Education, the racism, the animus, the racial hierarchy that slavery depicted, and all of that. But it also has its roots in this sense that pluralism in America, that a sense that we all have to figure out in a bigger tent, in a democracy, not only how to get along, but how that democratic moire, that pluralism, that sense that there's a social contract in this country that if you work hard and play by the rules, you should do okay, and your family should do okay, and your kids should do better than you do. And one of the ways that that happens is that we've created this system of public schools that are available and should be good for all kids, regardless of what you look like, where you come from, who your parents love, and whatnot. And what I was seeing in the last few years is that concept, that social concept was fraying. And you heard it from people like Chris Rufo, who said the way to get to universal vouchers, I'm paraphrasing him. He's already threatened to sue me a few times because I don't exactly have his quotation. So I am paraphrasing him. So, but what he said was essentially to get to universal vouchers, which is the deconstruction of public education, which is what white parents wanted to do in Virginia after Brown versus Board of Education. They didn't want their kids, not all white parents, but some white parents, they didn't want their kids going to schools with kids who had now gotten the right to say that separate is not equal. And so you see, they're saying that vouchers, to get the universal vouchers, you have to create universal public school distrust. So all of this division that you saw in, COVID, all of this, basically exploitation of the anxiety that was real, these culture wars, they're all for the purpose of creating universal distrust. And what else in America creates this kind of broad-based opportunity but public schooling? Why is it that the first thing the Trump administration wanted to do, get rid of the Department of Education? Look, I have problems with the Department of Education too, as you well know. But please, that's the first thing, not how we help our kids have a future. So this was worrying me that this was really intentional. It was intentional, the demise of public schools, the defunding of public schools. It was intentional, the undermining of pluralism. And then with the book banning and with the change, erasure of history, getting rid of DEI and all those programs, getting rid of student loan programs. It was the undermining of critical thinking, and not only knowledge acquisition or memorization, but knowledge, but knowledge application, but critical thinking. So I felt like, if not me, who? Like, I've been around for a while. My name is known as somebody who's like a teacher and a unionist. So I felt like, if I don't give this warning, who is going to do it? And then when Millie and Kelly did it during the election and warned people about fascism, they were mocked. So it was both a warning about what I was seeing in terms of education and the intentionality to destroy it, public education. It was a warning about how that interacts with fascistic behavior, because, the same warning that the founders did and gave, so many years ago about tyrants and about monarchists and about monarchy. And yet the other thing I wanted to do, though, was to actually pair it. I didn't want to just scream. I wanted to pair it with the solution. And I really believe, so it is a love letter to teachers, but I really believe it. Teachers are the antidote. Public education is, but teachers are the antidote to fascism or fascistic behavior, because teachers teach the habits of democracy. They teach kids how to live in a pluralistic society and like each other, or at least tolerate each other in a diverse way. A diverse set of kids, inclusive, equal opportunity. Let me use those words in a way that should be used. But they also teach kids critical thinking. And so they are the antidote. So that's why I wrote it when I wrote it. It kind of got more important to write post November, and it came out, at the beginning of the school year.
One of the things I really love about your book is that it sort of knits together all these bits and pieces of the history of public education in our country, with what we're seeing the Trump administration do now, to really kind of pull together a larger picture of what's happening in a way that I think is harder, as somebody who is not focused on public education every day, but also talks to a lot of parents who are really not focused on what Chris Rufo is saying every day, right? And they're seeing just little bits and pieces of this in their world. Of course, now, in many cases, they're seeing big pieces of it show up in their schools. And so having your book out there to really pull that together for them, of this is why you're seeing these attacks, I think is really powerful. I wanted to ask you, now I'm a little nervous that Chris Rufo is going to sue me as well, but I'm also paraphrasing him. I wanted to ask you about that quote that you mentioned, where he says something like, we need universal public school distrust. It really stuck with me because, as thinking about our strategy here, right? It's much, much easier to sow distrust in something than it is to build trust. So
Correct.
how do you can you talk about that a little bit, and how you think about your role, AFT's role, or even the role that the rest of us need to play in both combating that distrust, but also maybe deepening trust in public education?
So first off, I think we have to. So let me take it from three ways. Number one, and oftentimes, because we're so attacked, instead of actually, if there's a reaction to the attack, as opposed to, almost every attack has some seed of truth in it. And maybe it's my age that I'm seeing this now, but I think we should be thinking about and talking about strengthening, not abandoning public education. The goal that we have in public education. So I've moved from protecting or defending public education to, we have to strengthen it. Is a really important public good in the United States of America. It is the one thing that we say that we are giving to every single child in America. It's pretty amazing and cool to have it, but it doesn't always work. And our goal is all kids. Not some kids. We're not in a competitive market that says, okay, if we get to, 50% of the kids, we're okay. No, it's all kids. So we're in a constant loop of trying to get better. And that's okay. And we should make that okay. And so our goal has to be all kids, and our goal has to be always trying to strengthen it. The goal of the other side is abandoning it. That's what so one thing can go wrong and they say, okay, this one thing has gone wrong, get rid of it or just defund it. And we have to be able to fight that by not by saying everything's okay, but by saying our goal is continuous improvement for all kids. And celebrate the success, but do that. So that's number one. Number two, though, is this has to be fought on a really local level in communities, not just on the, in Washington, D.C. We need Washington to be about big policies, like the fact that there is no push by the federal government for safety for children. There's no understanding about what screens have done and cell phones have done. There should be a national, the future of kids should be part of a national push for children. And instead, what we do is we have basically a war on children by this administration. SNAP, ICE, Medicaid, getting rid of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Forget about getting rid of the Department of Education, getting rid of the title programs, making it impossible for kids to get a student loan. That's a war on children. So what we need to do is we need to fight those battles, but there needs to be some federal policy that equalizes the playing field and makes that better. But we have to create real community in schools. So that's why the relationship between teachers and parents are so important, and why these fights really have to happen on a local level, because they have to be a fight about our kids and our students. And what a shock. On a local level, people think about public education so much more favorably than they do on a national level. So building community, thinking about the problems and trying to solve them, not just being reflexive about, protecting public education as a public good. And then also, public education as a public good becomes important. So I would say we have to work on all three of those levels.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, the piece about public school, building a community in your public school really resonates for me. I think that is a lot of what we have in my local school system. And I do think there's a lot of trust there at the local level. I also see some of what the Trump administration is doing outside of their tax on education as a threat to that, because, you and I know there are costs that the Trump administration is driving up, not just for families, but for school districts as well. So when we talk about a war with Iran driving up the cost of gas, that's a cost that school districts pay as well. When we talk about higher electricity costs, that's a cost for school districts too. And you can see these things as like a disparate set of things the Trump administration is doing, or you can see them as part of a plan, because that is in direct opposition to building community. It's requiring school districts to make choices that are between a music program and, support for paraprofessionals for students with disabilities. It's really, really troubling. Can I ask you, despite all the attacks that we've seen on teachers, you say in your book that you would still advise someone to go into teaching today. So what would you say to people who are considering a career in teaching, or to teachers who are in the classroom but kind of wondering whether or not to stay? And what advice do you have for school leaders and parents?
So I, near the end of my book, talk about a poster that I have in every single, I schlepped it around to every single uh, um, office I've ever had. I'm trying to remember the page I have it on. It's like 30, It's near the end. One second. Here it is. It's on page 176. And the poster says, I'll show you, it kind of looks like this.
I've got
But
my
it's
copy here too.
okay. It says, it was given to me by one of my members, an art teacher. And it is, really simple but beautiful. And it says, I inspire, I encourage, I empower, I nurture, I activate, I motivate, I change the world. I am a teacher. And that is who teachers are. And I feel like one of my jobs is to lift up who people are, their basic, and you're about to have one of the most amazing teachers I know, Marcia Howard, and the mutual aid programs that she has created in Minneapolis, and the holding of the square, the George Floyd Square that she did, and the fact it was one of her students who did the video that made it clear that the police officer actually murdered George Floyd. I mean, the teachers are so much a fabric of community, and they are so much of a pillar of the whether we have a society that not only believes in its better angels, but does the work to make each generation better. And that's who teachers are. And so the my job is to help them have better conditions so that they can do their job, so that they can have better paid so they can do their job. That is the job of a union. It's all of our, but their jobs. And I miss teaching. I love teaching at Claire Barton High School in Brooklyn, New York. And I, teach from time to time in college now, but I can't take a class every single day, which I would love to do. But their job is to actually nation build and actually help the psyche of America, the moral value of America, the individual skill and knowledge, the confidence, the agency, the engagement of each and every child. I don't know of a better job, a more virtuous job to have as an adult. So that is why I keep saying to people, please teach.
I love that. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, and then we'll bring our other panelists in. The last chapter of your book is called The Way Forward. What do you think is the way forward from here, and what really gives you hope that we can get there?
So, look, I'm going to be at the No Kings in Minnesota next weekend.
Amazing.
What Minnesota has done gives me huge hope. No Kings, the millions of people who have stood outside and have said, we, and our no coalition, meaning our coalition that says, okay, there's lots of problems in our country. But one of the things since 250 years ago that we said was, no, we're going to govern ourselves. We're not going to have a king governing us, or somebody who's a wannabe king, or somebody who wants to take too much power from the people. And so what gives me hope is that regardless of what one's ideology was in Minnesota, people were repulsed by what ICE was doing. And at the same time, so many people have done mutual aid for our immigrant neighbors and for the stranger. People have said, no, this is not what we wanted when Donald Trump was elected. We wanted gas prices to be lower, not higher. We wanted families to be able to afford their lives. We didn't want endless wars. We didn't want these fights with our neighbors. I'm not talking about everyone, but what I am seeing in America is, when you have huge distrust, not the union movement actually has more trust in virtually any other institution. There's no trust in any of the political parties, but there is a sense that this is not what people voted for. And there is a sense in these broad coalitions across the country that says, no, We want the basic dignity that our country has aspired to from from 250 years ago.
I think that's right. I think it gives me a lot of hope to see that in as we see people speaking out and having their voice heard through polls and other ways about their dissatisfaction with the Trump administration, we're also seeing them even as the Trump administration would like us to believe that people have this massive distrust in public education, that people actually still do support it in large numbers, and they want to see it do the basic things that we want our public education system to do, to
Yeah,
really teach people, to teach kids the basics, but also to teach them the democratic values that you're
right.
talking about.
I
Um,
mean, you want the public education, you want everyone who goes through public education to feel like they were ready for their lives, for their
Absolutely.
careers, for college, but for also civic engagement.
Right.
We are nation builders, but we are also the helpers of individuals and families having a pathway to their own American dream.
I want to add Mike and Marcia to the conversation here. Let's welcome Mike Pierce, who again is the executive director of Protect Borrowers, and Marcia Howard, who's here with us from AFT Minneapolis. I wanted to start with some questions for you, Marcia, and Mike. I know you brought some questions too, so feel free to add. Um, how do you see what Randy has described in her book, which was somewhat kind of prescient about what might unfold in our schools? How do you see what she described playing out in the classroom today?
Hi, Randy. That's first.
Marcia?
Hi. Um, I want first to talk about the book itself, why fascists fear teachers, because she lays it all out, why um, education is anathema to authoritarianism, to the type of plutocratic regime that is currently running amok in our country, that's post-factual, post-moral, post even patriotic thing that we have going right now. It is diametrically opposed to what we practice in classrooms, what we have established with a meritocratizing, desegregated public education in the United States. And they don't like it. They do not like what we do in public education in the United States, which is why they are attacking us so vigorously. She names it and blames it and shames it. And in the state of Minnesota, we went on a strike in Minneapolis, our historic strike in 2022. I sort of said after we won, after 14 days on a strike line, that yeah, we won our strike, but the battle was going to begin. I knew that the state of Minnesota was going to be a proving ground for the fight for public education. I knew that the powers that be were going to come and attack our city, Minneapolis, because as our there used to be a saying, does it play in Peoria? But I think we are sort of that milquetoast Midwest flyover state that if they can make it play in our, majority white, progressive state, they can use this as a beta test for undermining public education across the nation. Um, and I think what they've seen was a group of educators stand up and be the vanguard against an authoritarian regime. I think they picked the wrong profession to mess with. They really, really did.
I wonder, Randy and Marcia, I think, it's hard to talk about public education in this country without talking about what's happening in Minnesota right now. I think it's become one of the most visible flashpoints in the national fight over immigration enforcement, which has you battling not only the Department of Education, but also an immigration and customs enforcement that is operating, in my view, like completely outside of the law. So what has that looked like on the ground? And Randy, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what AFT's response has been there.
Well, this is something that I really want Marcia to talk about because she and her local and the paraprofessional local and the St. Paul local have really led not only the resistance, but the mutual aid. But what essentially has happened is this, that the Trump administration thought that if they created a lot of fear, I mean, Marcia just said the post-factual society. So the first issue was, oh, all we're doing is going after criminals. Well, what they're doing instead is they have a quota that is not doable. And they didn't have enough ICE agents or Border Patrol agents. So they spent a lot of money advertising in places that you don't normally advertise for people in law enforcement and spend very little time training them. And so what you essentially had was this kind of, excuse me for saying it, a killing ground that started in LA and in Chicago and then really just all kind of metastasized in Minnesota, in Minneapolis and St. Paul for the very reasons that I think Marcia just spelled out. But the level of repulsiveness, the level of anti-constitutional behavior was really very evident in even 3 of these cases where the man who was, I think, of Munn, of the Munn grandfather taken out in his robe, where they just, barged into. I thought we used to have a Fourth Amendment. They barged into the house. Renee Good shot at in Flashpoint when she was just trying to say, "Are you okay?" to the ICE agent, and then the nurse, Mr. Preddy, and the way in which he was trying to help somebody. I mean, the level of and there were things that you didn't see, like the flashbang that happened to one of our members in his own car with his own kids as he was trying to go between a school and another work site. The pulling of the hair of a teacher in Roosevelt High School. The level of repulsive behavior to try to create fear and to try to say, oh, don't help your neighbor. If you don't help your neighbor, then you're not going to have a problem. And what Minnesota did was they said, oh no, we're not only helping our neighbor, we're standing in our neighbor's stead. We're going to actually walk our neighbor's kids to school. We're going to do what we can to make sure we feed our neighbor. And so we've done a whole bunch of stuff to help, like getting people whistles, getting people, all sorts of different, assistance.
PPE. I called
PPE.
I called Randy crying.
Yeah.
I said the air is filled with smoke because they were doing flashbangs and grenades and we couldn't breathe. And she's like, I got you. And AFT stood in the gap for us with protective gear. But I need y'all to understand, whatever you thought was happening in Minneapolis, it's worse than you thought. Yes, they threw a flashbang in the car of my member and his wife, both of whom are paraprofessionals, but their 6 children were in the car, including their 6-month baby.
Wow.
Who had a seizure and all of them had to be hospitalized. Yeah, they pulled the hair of one of my members who's a paraprofessional in Roosevelt High School, but they did it at drop-off time, not drop-off time, but closing time at the school, and they attacked the school with the students there. And that's my school that I've taught at for 25 years.
with
And on
pepper
that, and
spray, with all this stuff so that you can't see. You can't, I mean, Marcia and
And
I could regale you.
while Greg Bovino was filming a vanity project, and 2 days later, Christy Nome was filming down the street from my house.
Unbelievable.
So she parked on my street of my home to film a vanity piece. And it became targeted, and you understood that they were going after people of color, they were going after queer folks, and they were going after union leaders. So it was not random, the violence. It's
It's
not
not,
been random. It wasn't random for David Huerta in LA. It hasn't been random. All the threats that have been sailed against union leaders across the nation since all of this has been happening. But what has been very, very heartwarming is the way our union members banded together with family groups, with neighborhood groups, with immigrant activists, with neighborhood organizations to heighten our communication networks, encrypted chats. I'm talking hockey moms and soccer dads and people who didn't even know what a signal chat was were running plates by the next week.
yeah.
Folks were and still are paying rent and utilities and making sure that folks who have not been able to work since December for fear of being racially profiled, they're getting groceries. They're having walking school buses so that we're protecting people as they go to school and come home from school. Everyone wears whistles, and everyone makes sure that if we don't know any words, we know the words La Migra so we can warn folks in our neighborhoods. They wanted the specter of brown and black people cowering in fear, and what they got was blue-eyed blonde folks with whistles and cell phones putting their lives on the line, and in fact, as you know, losing lives because they will not let the federal government run roughshod over us, not in our public schools, not in our streets, not in our stores.
What I really like, about, well, I mean, there's nothing I like about what you're saying. It's incredibly distressing, right? But what I like about the connection to the book here, Randy, is that you're helping us draw the line between the targeting of immigrant families, of Black families, of union members and union leaders to that larger destruction of public education. There's not really an option here to say, this isn't me, this is
Yeah,
about someone else. This is actually about all of us.
just that's why if you just take what Rufo said or what Pompeo said and understand they tried to figure out how to divide, how to demonize, how to create distrust. And when it gets to a fascistic behavior, it dehumanizes, it creates violence. And so think about the scenes that we saw in the 30s in Germany and Austria, and think about the scenes that we saw in Minnesota and Minneapolis. And the difference, frankly, is in Minneapolis, 50 to 75,000 people the day of that was called for no school, no work, no shopping. Our work was to be on the streets. I mean, it was freaking cold. Marcia deals with that cold. I don't deal with that cold. It was like 10 degrees, 20 degrees below zero. And you had 50 to 75,000 people on the streets. And the difference, this is where you want to see hope, that it was that people, there is something, what the federal government didn't understand about Minnesotans is that Minnesota nice is actually a thing. It's actually really a thing. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no racism or sexism or all this other stuff. But that mutual aid that happened that Marcia was talking about, that's real. And we still need it because ICE has not gone away. It's part of the reason that we're still doing we're doing a different kind of Target boycott, but we're actually boycotting Target for back to school. We're saying to people, shop local, because Target, who is headquartered in Minnesota, they can't get themselves to say ice out of Minnesota.
Wow.
So but this is the work of local and national, because everything happens on the ground. So the national union has to really support what's happening on the ground, because we have to support Marsha Howard and we have to support our members there, and they have to know that we are supporting. That's what a union is. That's community. So what you're seeing, Julie, is that you're seeing us basically saying, let's show what community means.
I want to shift us a little bit to talk about cost of living. I know AFT has been very focused on this, and in our work at the Century Foundation, we have seen this we believe there's a really direct line between the economic precarity that the Trump administration is forcing on American families and that openness to the kind of strongman politics that you talk about in your book. And so, how I want to ask the question generally, how do you think about the centrality of cost of living in your work? But let's start with Mike, because I know we haven't gotten you into our conversation. How do you see that connection between debt and authoritarianism, and how does it influence your work?
So
So,
we see
you
those
go.
connections. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Randy.
No, you go, Mike. You and I will probably answer it in the same exact way.
I think that's right. So we see this across the economy. When people don't have wealth to fall back on, when their lives feel brittle, they're more prone to focus on what's right in front of them, keeping a roof over their head, making ends meet, paying those bills, and don't have the emotional space, the physical space, the economic space to be able to challenge the forces that are keeping them in financial precarity. But much more specifically, as it relates to working people, we also see the Trump administration weaponizing debt, specifically student debt, against people to try to shift the way the labor market works, to shift the way that employers act, to try to push disfavored activities like standing up for our undocumented fellow Americans and providing medical care to trans youth and fighting for DEI. Those kinds of activities the White House disfavors. They're willing to put the ability of public service employers to participate in the public service loan forgiveness program, a student debt relief program, on the line for everyone that works for a city government that is also a sanctuary city, for every person employed by a legal aid agency that's also providing representation to undocumented people. And we've been really lucky to represent Randy and AFT along with the cities of Boston and Chicago and the National Council of Nonprofits and folks across the country in challenging that in federal court. And really, I think that it's important. Randy, in your book, you talk about how critical thinking is a big legacy of educators. It's something that makes the American polity work. And I think when we think about these kinds of cases, getting into court, challenging authoritarianism, looking at the way that debt and economic precarity is weaponized against people, that critical thinking is like the last bulwark we have against fascism.
Right.
Because when you're too overwhelmed by financial precarity, when the pressure is too intense, what do you have to fall back on? Fascists depend on that.
So I would even think about it in this way, and this is that, and both Marsha and I have the honor to represent a whole bunch of low-wage workers, and she's not giving herself enough credit, because in that Minnesota strike, that Minneapolis Federation of Teachers strike from, what was it, 2022? Was it that the teachers in Minneapolis pushed to have a higher wage increase for the low wage workers than for the teachers. And they stayed out to get that higher wage increase. And so that is the nature of building community and of helping each other. And that's what a union movement, I hope in the best of ways, tries to do. What Mike's talked about, the weaponization of debt, in a really important way. But think about what is that debt think about it in some ways this way. And look, when I was growing up, my father was laid off from his job for a couple of years, and he was an electrical engineer. And I saw the wrestling that my parents did trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And my mother was a teacher, and my father felt, and every time the Republicans would say, oh, people are out of work because they want to be. I watched my father scour every single day the pages to get a new job. He hated being out of work. He hated what it meant to him. And so it's just this notion of who people are and the dignity of working people. We have actually lost that in this in this social media disinformation post-fact society. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to actually say to Democrats in particular, you have to make common cause with workers again. You can't talk as cheap. What are you actually going to do? And look, I'm a Democrat. I've been a Democrat my whole life. I left the DNC because I wanted some more independence, and my members wanted me to have some more independence. But what is the common cause you're going to make? So we have taken, I don't know, Mike, how many cases? 10, 15? We take cases, it feels like every other minute, to try to make the student loan apparatus work so that it does actually adhere to the rule that if you want to go to college, we're going to do everything in our power to make college affordable so you can go to college. And this administration does everything in the opposite way, including the weaponization that they just talked about. Number two, what we've tried to do is the number one priority that we have as a union. You would think it is, okay, I want more money for education spending. And we do. Our number one priority for this legislative session and the next one is a working class tax cut, paid for by billionaires, but we need to actually find a way to get to and deal with this affordability crisis. And yes, it needs to be higher wages for people. But in the absence of that this moment, and yes, it'd be great to have a child tax cut again. But in the absence of all of that, these billionaires who've gotten huge amounts of money, give some back so that the working class, that if you don't make enough for a living wage, let the federal government subsidize you some. And so that's part of what we're trying to do. And we're also doing a whole bunch of self-help stuff about navigating student debt and medical debt and credit card debt. But people are living on debt. And can you imagine the end of a month not knowing, okay, do I pay this for food or do I pay this for rent? In 2026, that shouldn't be happening in the United States of America in the wealthiest country in the world.
I want to make sure that we have time for a couple of questions from the audience, and we got a couple in advance. I'm going to ask the first one of them, and we'll start with Randy, but I'm curious for Marcia's response to this one as well. How should educators engage with colleagues who have different political views, in particular those who are kind of ascribing to a set of views that we associate with like the kind of like MAGA Trump Republican?
Well, let me actually look. I think we have to have a bigger tent, and I think we cannot take issues around dignity are different than issues around policy. Like I really don't like the vouchers and using vouchers as and it hurting public schools. But there's a lot of people within the Catholic Church and Orthodox Jews who really believe in it. And so we have to be able to have a conversation without being each other's mortal enemy. That's really different than an issue about disappearing one's neighbor. That's really different than a moral issue about racism or about anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. That's really different than killing a Black man who was on the ground and choking him. So there has to be a way of thinking about issues as different than human dignity. And I think that if we are thinking about issues, we can have those conversations. The last thing I'll say is, like, for example, there's a lot of Moms for Liberty folk who believe, like we do, that we need to actually limit screens in schools, and that screens have actually hurt the feeling of belonging that kids have. Why not work together on that?
Marcia, did you want to add to that?
Yes. I'm a Black liberationist, and one of the things that I think can address actually something that Mike was talking about, and even about the question that you just posed, is this country was founded on anti-indigeneity and anti-Blackness, and even issues like vouchers are based in anti-Blackness. It's based in exclusivity and attempting to resegregate the school system. And this is separate from Catholic school, parochial schools, and or Jewish day schools. That's a completely separate issue. But for the most part, people who are advocating for vouchers in rural, rural road Minnesota could care less about a Catholic school or a
Exactly.
Jewish school. They just want to use public monies for their own particular aims, and privateers want to dismantle public education. And so if we get I often say that sometimes my members, the only thing blue about them is our union colors. And I love all my union members. And so that to echo what Randy says, what are the things that we share, the common values that we share? And one of the things is maybe the opposition to debt slavery. But I always couch it in, you do realize when I went to the University of Minnesota in 1994, the tuition was $3,800 a year. And it was only when they got to a point where 8% of their student body was African American that they started raising the price. They started making it exclusive, and they quit the general college, which was a lower price entry point. In order to keep Black folk and brown folk from doing stuff, they make everybody suffer. And and America will cut its nose off to spite its face. They will gladly eat ground chuck as long as a Negro won't eat a steak. And we need to be honest about that. We don't have good health care because, God forbid, Black folks get it. But I'm in Minnesota. We're so progressive that they had to swoop in here and accuse every Somali person of being illegal. They're not. Being fraudulent. They're not. It's not our fault that we have a surplus every year. We had a $19 billion surplus. You know what we did? Pass universal free lunch. Every child in this state gets free lunch. You know what we did? Pass every child in this state gets to go to college for free as long as their parents make less than $80,000. You know what we did? We just passed unemployment for every paraprofessional and lunch lady in this state during the summer. They don't have to go get another job during the summer. They just collect unemployment until school starts again.
I want to make sure we get, I'm sorry, Marcia, I don't want to cut you off, but I know we're closing in on time, and I want to make sure that we get just one more question in here.
No problem. But Julie, you see that you have to be able to have a give and take. And what Marcia does in her local, she has that give and take. And people feel like they can say what they need to say. As long as people respect the human dignity of each other, people feel that way. We need to have more of that in America.
Well, it speaks so much to what you all were saying about community. That's so much easier to do when you're treating what you're doing as working in community. I wanted to get to one last question, and I think it ties together some of what you're saying about cost of living with the kind of like commitment that you all have to bringing new teachers into the space. We got a question from a teacher educator who says, They struggle with preparing teachers for the burdens that this job carries and for so little remuneration. What's our advice to would-be teachers and to the educators who are helping push them along?
Let me just say, that's part of the reason why when they get to a school system, they need to have a union, because there is no one these days that are going to help individual teachers unless we are in solidarity with each other, or individual paraprofessionals. This is very much like the question that I often ask legal professors these days, which is like, how do you teach the Constitution right now? How do you do it? I mean, there's a moral value, there's a statutory value. So literally, we have to fight to make sure that teachers and paraprofessionals and the precarious workers of our country have the dignity and respect to which they're due. But the other side is going to make it untenable to be a teacher. And so it puts everybody in that vice right now.
I think that's a really good place to end this conversation. I want to thank all of you for participating, and particularly for Randy. I want to remind everyone one more time, this is Randy's book. I read the book in the paperback version, but I also listened to the audiobook, which Randy reads herself, which was really lovely. You have a very soothing voice, but you also have a very powerful message. So thank you so much for being here today, and we really appreciate it.
And thank you, Julie, and thank you, Mike, and really, truly, thank you, Marcia.
Thank you so much. Take care.